The operation in Venezuela was initially presented as a contained and decisive action, designed to achieve specific objectives within a narrow geographic and political scope. Early developments suggested a rapid resolution centered on Caracas, reinforcing the impression that the situation could be managed through focused military and economic pressure. However, as events unfolded, that assumption began to erode. What appeared at first to be a limited intervention gradually revealed itself as a far more complex confrontation, extending beyond Venezuela's borders and drawing in multiple actors across different domains. The crisis evolved not through a single dramatic escalation, but through a series of adaptive responses that widened its reach. Measures intended to constrain Venezuela's options instead generated new behaviors, forcing enforcement efforts to expand in scope and intensity. Each adjustment produced secondary effects, creating additional fronts rather than closing existing ones. The result was a situation no longer confined to land operations or domestic control, but one that began to intersect with maritime enforcement, regional security, and international diplomacy. This expansion exposed a central vulnerability in the operation's design. The strategy assumed that pressure would remain unilateral and largely uncontested. Instead, it encountered an environment in which other states possessed both the incentive and the capability to respond, as Venezuela sought alternative means of sustaining economic activity. The confrontation shifted from an internal matter to an external test of enforcement capacity. The operational theater widened, and with it, the risks multiplied. The transformation of the crisis also altered its character. What began as a show of power aimed at achieving compliance increasingly resembled a contest over credibility and reach. Enforcement actions were no longer judged solely by their immediate effectiveness, but by their ability to withstand countermeasures and international scrutiny. Each new development signaled that the operation was no longer operating in isolation, but within a crowded and contested international space. By this stage, the Venezuela situation could no longer be described as a contained mission. It had become a multi-front confrontation, touching naval security, regional alliances, and global norms. The initial objectives remained, but they were now accompanied by unintended consequences that reshaped the strategic environment. The operation's evolution marked the beginning of a broader test, not only of policy effectiveness, but of how power is exercised and resisted across the Atlantic system. One of the clearest indicators of this expansion was the emergence of a naval standoff centered on a single oil tanker. The vessel, formerly known as Bella 1, underwent a rapid transformation that carried significant strategic weight. Its name was changed to Marinara, its markings altered, and it was re-registered under Russian authority. By painting a Russian flag and shifting its legal status, the tanker moved beyond the category of a sanctioned Venezuelan asset and entered a far more sensitive domain. This change was not symbolic. By placing the tanker under Russian registration, Venezuela effectively sought the protection of a major power with both naval reach and political leverage. The move altered the enforcement calculus. What had previously been a matter of seizing or intercepting a sanctioned vessel now carried the risk of direct confrontation with Russia. The tanker's route brought this tension into European waters, off the coast of Ireland, where the implications of the reflagging became immediately apparent. In response, Russia deployed a submarine and naval vessels to escort the Marinara. This action transformed the situation from a routine enforcement effort into a high-stakes naval encounter. The presence of Russian military assets signaled that any attempt to seize the tanker would not occur in a vacuum. The United States, which intended to intercept the vessel, now faced the prospect of engaging not just a tanker, but a protected convoy. The standoff illustrated a new tactic emerging from the crisis. By seeking protection from a rival power, sanctioned actors could complicate enforcement without directly escalating on their own. The use of reflagging and escort blurred the line between economic sanctions and military confrontation. What had been designed as a financial choke point now intersected with naval deterrence. This episode demonstrated how quickly enforcement measures could be countered through legal and military maneuvering. the Marinara became more than a ship. It became a test of resolve and restraint. The tactic exposed the limits of unilateral enforcement when confronted by a capable adversary willing to challenge it directly. As a result, the crisis expanded further, moving from economic pressure into the realm of direct power politics at sea. The decision to escort the Marinara marked a decisive shift in the character of the confrontation. Once Russian naval assets entered the picture, enforcement was no longer a matter of intercepting a sanctioned tanker under disputed legal authority. It became a scenario in which two major powers were operating in close proximity with opposing objectives. The United States maintained its intention to seize the vessel, while Russia's presence was explicitly designed to prevent that outcome. This overlap transformed policy enforcement into a live test of power projection. The situation carried risks that extended beyond the tanker itself. Naval escorts are not passive signals. They are deterrent mechanisms meant to impose costs on interference. By deploying a submarine and surface vessels, Russia communicated that any attempt to board or divert the Marinara would be interpreted as a direct challenge. This forced a recalculation. The enforcement of sanctions now required weighing not only legal justification, but the possibility of military escalation with a nuclear-armed state. What made the confrontation particularly significant was its asymmetry. The original objective had been to restrict Venezuela's ability to move oil and generate revenue. Instead, the enforcement effort exposed the United States to a confrontation far removed from its initial scope, a measure intended to constrain a regional actor now. Risked entanglement with a global rival. The escalation did not stem from aggressive expansion by Venezuela, but from its ability to draw in external protection. This dynamic highlighted a growing pattern within the crisis. Adaptation proved easier for the sanctioned party than for the enforcer. By altering registration and seeking protection, Venezuela effectively shifted the burden of escalation upward. Each enforcement step now required consideration of broader geopolitical consequences. The cost of action rose, while the effectiveness of pressure diminished. The naval standoff underscored how quickly enforcement actions can lose clarity once rival powers are involved. What had been framed as a matter of sanctions compliance became indistinguishable from power politics. The presence of Russian escorts altered the rules of engagement without formally changing them, introducing ambiguity that constrained response options. In this sense, the Marinara episode revealed a deeper vulnerability. Sanctions and seizures rely on assumptions of uncontested access and limited resistance. When those assumptions no longer hold, enforcement becomes a strategic gamble rather than a procedural act. The confrontation at sea demonstrated how the Venezuela operation had crossed a threshold, evolving into a direct test of resolve between major powers operating in the same space. The limits of enforcement became even more apparent when examined against the broader blockade that was meant to isolate Venezuela economically. The announcement of a total and complete blockade signaled an intent to shut down maritime access and choke off oil exports decisively. On paper, the measure suggested overwhelming control of sea lanes and compliance through deterrence. In practice, the results diverged sharply from the stated objective. Despite the declaration, oil continued to move. Since the capture of Maduro, at least 16 tankers successfully departed Venezuelan waters and evaded the blockade. This was not the result of isolated oversight or chance navigation. The pattern pointed to a coordinated exodus, indicating that Venezuela and its partners anticipated enforcement measures and prepared alternative routes and methods in advance. Rather than freezing maritime activity, the blockade prompted adaptation. The persistence of oil shipments exposed a critical mismatch between announcement and execution. A blockade's effectiveness depends not only on intent, but on comprehensive coverage and sustained enforcement. In this case, the scope of the operation fell short of those requirements. Enforcement gaps allowed vessels to slip through, undermining the credibility of the blockade itself. Each successful departure weakened the perception that the blockade could deliver decisive results. This failure had cascading effects. As tankers continued to move, It signaled to other operators that enforcement was neither airtight nor immediate. The deterrent effect diminished with each successful evasion. Instead of collapsing Venezuelan exports, the blockade created a selective pressure that favored operators willing to operate in gray zones and exploit regulatory blind spots. The outcome was not a sudden halt in oil production, but a slowdown that stopped short of collapse. Revenue continued to flow, even if at reduced levels. This distinction mattered strategically. The objective had been to force rapid economic submission. What emerged instead was a prolonged contest in which pressure produced resilience, rather than capitulation. The ineffective blockade highlighted a central challenge of the operation. Enforcement measures assumed a level of control that proved difficult to maintain against a flexible and adaptive network. The gap between declared policy and operational reality widened, reinforcing the sense that the Venezuela crisis was no longer governed by unilateral decisions alone. Instead, it was becoming a contest defined by evasion, countermeasures, and diminishing returns on pressure. A central reason the blockade failed to achieve its intended effect was the continued operation of what is known as the Dark Fleet. These vessels function outside standard maritime transparency, exploiting gaps in monitoring and enforcement. Many operate by disabling their transponders, manipulating location data, or obscuring ownership and registration. This allows them to move cargo while minimizing detection, making them particularly effective in environments shaped by sanctions and partial enforcement. In the Venezuela case, the Dark Fleet played a decisive role in sustaining oil exports. While some vessels were subject to sanctions, a significant proportion were not. Only around 40% of Dark Fleet ships servicing Venezuela fell under U.S. sanctions, leaving hundreds of vessels legally outside the blockade's reach. This imbalance created a structural weakness. Enforcement efforts targeted a visible subset of activity, while a larger, less transparent network continued operating with relative freedom. The result was continuity rather than collapse. Oil production slowed, reflecting the increased difficulty and cost of transport, but it did not cease. Tankers continued to load and depart, often under altered identities or routes designed to avoid scrutiny. Revenue flows were reduced but not eliminated. This outcome undermined the core assumption behind the blockade, that cutting maritime access would rapidly deprive Venezuela of economic lifelines. The persistence of the Dark Fleet also altered risk calculations across the market. Operators willing to function in opaque conditions gained an advantage, while compliant actors withdrew. This selective pressure reshaped the ecosystem rather than shutting it down. Enforcement did not remove capacity. It redistributed it toward actors accustomed to operating beyond conventional oversight. From a strategic perspective, this dynamic exposed the limitations of sanctions regimes in a fragmented maritime environment. Effective blockades require near total coverage to succeed. Partial enforcement invites circumvention. In this case, the Dark Fleet functioned as a release valve, preventing pressure from reaching a critical threshold. Each successful voyage reinforced the perception that the system could be worked around. The continued flow of oil also carried symbolic weight. It demonstrated that Venezuela retained agency despite escalating pressure. The ability to adapt through Dark Fleet operations signaled to allies and adversaries alike that enforcement had practical limits. Rather than isolating Venezuela completely, the blockade revealed how modern sanctions can be diluted by decentralized adaptive networks. In this way, the Dark Fleet was not a side element of the crisis, but a central mechanism shaping its outcome. Its operation ensured that pressure translated into friction rather than rupture, prolonging the confrontation and further eroding confidence in the effectiveness of unilateral maritime control. The expanding scope of the crisis also triggered immediate reactions from neighboring states, most notably Colombia. As tensions intensified, Colombian President Gustavo Petro ordered the mobilization of security forces along the border with Venezuela. This move reflected growing concern that the situation was no longer contained and that instability could spill across national boundaries. The mobilization was framed as a defensive measure aimed at preventing escalation rather than facilitating it. Colombia's response carried political significance as well as security implications by publicly condemning the U.S. strikes and warning against further destabilization. The Colombian government signaled discomfort with the trajectory of the operation. The emphasis was placed on regional stability and the risks posed by prolonged confrontation. Rather than aligning fully with enforcement actions, Colombia positioned itself as a stakeholder exposed to the consequences of escalation. The concerns centered on spillover effects. Border regions are particularly sensitive to disruptions, and heightened military activity increases the risk of unintended incidents. Colombia's leadership emphasized that actions taken against Venezuela could generate pressures that neighboring countries would be forced to manage, regardless of their involvement in the decision-making process. This framing underscored a growing disconnect between those executing the operation and those absorbing its secondary effects. Colombia's stance also reflected a broader regional anxiety about precedent. The mobilization was not only about immediate security, but about signaling resistance to normalization of cross-border force. By acting visibly and vocally, Colombia sought to assert that regional stability could not be subordinated to unilateral enforcement. Strategies without consultation. The episode demonstrated how the Venezuela crisis was beginning to reshape regional dynamics. States that might otherwise remain neutral were compelled to respond as risks mounted. Colombia's actions illustrated that the operation's impact extended beyond its intended targets, pulling neighboring countries into a security posture they had not chosen. This reaction marked another step in the transformation of the crisis. What began as an operation focused on Venezuela increasingly imposed costs on the surrounding region. Colombia's mobilization highlighted how enforcement measures reverberated outward, creating new pressures and aligning regional actors around concerns of stability, rather than compliance. The regional response broadened further as multiple governments moved beyond individual statements and coordinated their opposition. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain, and Uruguay issued a joint declaration condemning the operation as a violation of sovereignty and a dangerous precedent. The statement reflected a shared concern that the use of force without broad consent undermined principles that smaller and mid-sized states rely on for protection within the international system. This collective reaction carried weight precisely because of its diversity. The countries involved differed in political orientation and strategic priorities, yet converged on the same conclusion. Their alignment suggested that the issue was not confined to ideology, but rooted in structural anxiety about how power was being exercised. The operation in Venezuela was interpreted not as an isolated case, but as an example of how norms could be bypassed when they conflicted with the interests of a powerful state. By framing the action as a dangerous precedent, the statement highlighted fears of normalization. If sovereignty could be overridden in this instance, similar justifications could be applied elsewhere. For states with limited capacity to deter coercion, this possibility carried significant implications. The response therefore focused less on Venezuela itself and more on the broader rules governing international conduct. Spain's inclusion added an additional dimension. As a European country with historical ties to Latin America, its participation reinforced the perception that the concern extended beyond the region. The joint statement signaled that the operation risks straining relationships not only in the Americas, but across the Atlantic. This widened the diplomatic cost of the crisis, transforming it into a matter of international legitimacy. The unified response also underscored a shift in how alignment is expressed. Rather than deferring automatically to U.S. leadership, these countries chose to articulate independent positions. The willingness to issue a coordinated condemnation suggested that the traditional expectation of acquiescence was weakening. The operation, instead of consolidating influence, appeared to be encouraging collective resistance. This moment marked a turning point in the diplomatic dimension of the crisis. Opposition was no longer fragmented or muted. It was organized, public, and framed around shared principles. The Venezuela operation had become a catalyst for broader debate about sovereignty, precedent, and the acceptable limits of force, further expanding the scope of the confrontation.